I need to read something to you, and it's because it's a response to something, and it's a position that I ultimately find myself siding with. Steven Pinker in 2002 appeared on the New York Times bestsellers list with the book The Blank Slate: The Modern Denial of Human Nature, a book that attempts to catapult the nature nurture issue back into public debate. By the way, I don't really believe in public debate or what the public thinks about these matters because, to be honest with you, the only real debate that matters is the one that's taking place among scientists. The public is often woefully ill prepared and laymannish to take any part in this, but while squarely coming down on the side of human nature, I shall argue, however, that an overwhelming evidence that learning exerts the most significant influence on human behavior, a fact that is rarely acknowledged or publicized or even understood. If anything, there is a modern denial of human nurture, not human nature. The case for human nurture. In his review of Speaker's book, the behavioral biologist Patrick Bateson wrote that it may lead to yet another round of the tediously increasingly irrelevant nature nurture debate. Although I resist being drawn into more tedious debate on the nature nurture issue, Pinker's prominence as a public individual demands a rejoinder and compels me to make the following assertions. Humans come into the world much closer to the blank end of the continuum than any other species. Most of what humans know how to do is not present in any form at birth. Many, if not the most important similarities and differences in behavior between individuals can parsimoniously be explained due to learning. These are so obviously true. It seems odd to have to repeat them, but the scientific evidence for the influence of learning on human behavior is overwhelming. All other species rely upon reflexes or fixed action patterns that, although not insensitive to learning experiences, are relatively stable. Examples include aggressive displays, courtship and mating, migration, imprinting, care of the young. Human behavior, on the other hand, is noteworthy for its variability. As evolutionary Douglas Fukunaga so aptly put it, on balance, the evidence for the modificability of human behavior is so great that genetic constraints on our behavior certainly seem to exist. The dominant factor in recent human evolution has been the evolution of the behavioral flexibility, the ability to learn and to transmit culture. You know, uh, there's some footnotes there, so the renowned evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr also acknowledged the flexibility of human behavior with his distinction between open and closed programs. According to Mayr, closed programs include reflexes, fixed pattern actions controlled by areas of the brain that are rigidly programmed by genes. Other areas of the brain, e.g., the language areas, are suitable for open programs because that information is not rigidly programmed the way that reflexes are. These are primed by certain learning experiences early in life, while even more general areas of the brain, i.e., the association cortexes, remain malleable to learning experiences throughout life. No one would deny that genes selected throughout human evolutionary history code for our nervous system that makes possible our evolutionary extraordinary ability to learn, or that some genes may be specialized for such learning. But let us not forget that all genetic expression, from relatively simply Mendelian traits such as eye color to complex behavioral tendencies such as verbal behavior, is dependent on environmental input. Such input can be located on a continuum from the very simple stimuli that elicit reflexes to the complex associative processes that produce learning. The crux of the debate is not whether genes influence learning or behavior. No behavioral scientist would claim that they don't, but rather how they influence learning and behavior. The flip side of the equation, and one that is of interest to me as a behavioral psychologist, is how the experiences we call learning influence behavior. This question is much easier to answer because the experiences that produce learning are easily accessible to experimental scrutiny, and there already exists sound experimental work from which to draw. But first, we must clarify that the relationship between learning and evolution by natural selection is as causes of the behavior. The human nature nurture debate is typically portrayed as a simplistic paradigm, sorry, in the nature of nature and the proponents claim that genes exert the overriding influence on human behavior, such as language, intelligence, and social and sexual relations. In the human nurture corner, proponents argue that learning exerts the overwhelming influence. Put in these terms, nurture proponents win hands down. In other words, even though our ability to learn is made possible by a nervous system shaped by a particular evolutionary history, these experiences scientists call learning account for most of the similarities and differences between individuals. In this regard, behavioral psychologist Alice suggests that learning may be viewed along with evolution as a set of ultimate causation of behavior. Since at least the 1960s, Ernst Meyer has argued that every process in a living organism is a result of two separate causations called proximate, i.e., functional, and ultimate, evolutionary. The ultimate causation explains why an organism is the way it is as a product of evolution. According to Meyer, because the ultimate causation relates to the origin of adaptation or diversity, it answers why questions such as why are desert animals usually colored like the substrate. Such questions deal with the historical and evolutionary factors that account for all aspects of living organisms that may exist now or have existed in the past. Meyer reminds us that it was Darwin who was responsible for making why questions scientifically legitimate, for bringing all natural history into science. If we want to know why an organism exhibits a particular behavior, we are now asking about the behavior's natural history and its ultimate causation. Therefore, it makes sense to adopt Ulysses' modification of Meyer's strictly evolutionary or phylogenetic account of ultimate causation to include the life history or ontogeny of the organism. Thus, in this neo-Meyeran view, the ultimate causes of behavior, especially in humans, occur in both the evolutionary history of the species and in learning history of the individual. Explanations involving both types of ultimate causations necessarily involve speculative accounts of the natural history of the behavioral phenotype, interpretations based on basic principles of evolution and learning carried out by evolutionary biologists and behavioral psychologists specifically, respectively. Evolution, learning, and the nervous system. Nature has tried to buttress their position by marshaling evidence from neurobiology. They do this in at least two ways. First, the evolutionary psychologists assert that there are specifically evolved molecules in the brain that underlie particular human abilities. Other scientists seriously question such claims, however. For example, neuroevolutionary biologists Jack and Jules Pankenship bluntly state by simply accepting the remarkable degree of neocortical plasticity within the human brain, especially during development, genetically dictated sociobiological models begin to resemble the products of dubious human ambition rather than of sound scientific reasoning. Psychologist William Motto calls this modular approach the new phrenology. In fact, serious scholars argue that instead of containing the specifically evolved or specialized modules for emotion or language, as evolutionary psychologists suggest, the human brain is more accurately described as consisting of subcortical systems shared with other mammals that interact with a more recently evolved human neocortex that is specialized for learning. Second, naturists point to studies using brain images techniques to support their claims of inheritability of behavior. It's fashionable nowadays for psychologists and neuroscientists to use functional resonance machine or imaging scans to view the brain while subjects engage in various activities. Despite a flurry of studies in such years, some scholars note that serious methodological and interpretative problems that plague this research. More to the point, however, locating areas of the brain related to certain behaviors in no way implicates inheritance as an ultimate cause. For example, a recent study compared brain scans during the recognition test in adults who, as children, were judged as shy or inhibited, with adults who were more or not judged as shy. The results showed more activity in certain areas, the amygdala, the brains of the once shy adults. The media reported that the study lent support for the inheritance of shyness. However, nothing in these or any other results purportedly showing brain behavior relationships suggested inheritance as the ultimate cause. Simply identifying structures in the brain that seem to relate to behavior does not in itself implicate either evolution or learning as the ultimate cause. In fact, A sizable body of research shows that the learning changes the physical and chemical structure of the brain. Readers may already be familiar with experiments by Mark Rosenwig or William T. Greeno and their colleagues, which show that placing rats in either impoverished or enriched environments produce changes not only in their behavior but in the structure of the neurons and synapses in their brains, dendritic synapses, branching synaptic and neuronal density, and synapses per neuron. Other research on non human animals shows that specific learning experiences produce measurable changes in the nervous system. For example, Nobel Prize winning neuroscientist Eric Kandel and his colleagues have shown changes in the structure and function of individual neurons as a function of classical Pavlovian conditioning. And research by Joseph Ledox and his colleagues has shown that classically conditioned fear in rodents changes the amygdala, which controls fear reactions by outputting projections to the behavioral, autonomic, and endocrine response control systems located in the brainstem. Of more interest, however, are data showing that learning experiences produce changes in the human brain. One study showed that behavioral methods used but to ameliorate dyslexia in children improved reading performance and increased activities in the corresponding brain areas as observed using an MRI. In another study, PET scans found metabolic changes in the associated brain area in patients with major depressive disorders who were treated with interpersonal psychotherapy as well as medication. Yet another study showed that successful behavior modification of obsessive compulsive disorder produced changes in the function of the part of the brain called the caudate nucleus. So let's look at the citations later. Pinker regards the facts as these facts as obvious and unconvincing, but they do then support for a view of human nature of the human brain in which neurophysiological underpinnings of behavior are established by learning experiences rather than being specialized evolved modules. Pinker is correct about one thing, however. Neuroplasticity is just another name for learning and development, described in a different area, a different level of analysis. This echoes B.F. Skinner's contention that the way that we may study the laws of learning without knowledge or consideration, the laws of learning without knowledge or consideration of the underlying neurostructures and processes. Although I am reluctant to use the phrase, quote, blank slate for fear of being caricatured, I will venture to say that the human neocortex is a relative blank slate, and there is neurological evidence to support this contention. The well-known pediatric neurologist Harry Kugani, sorry if I butchered the pronunciation here to this neurologist, and his colleagues Positron Emerson, like again, apologies. Tomography PET scans, which measure, positron emission, tomography again, this is not some area of science in which I'm deeply familiar, which measure glucose metabolism level that occurs when the neurons fire to compare brain activity in newborns to that of older children and adults. In general, they found that the most activity in the neocortex brain occurs in the primary sensory and motor cortex, thalamus, and brainstem areas associated with primitive reflexes in infants. Activity in the frontal cortex and other cortical areas associated with higher cortical and cognitive function to more learning experiences as a result of interacting with the social and non-social environment areas of the cortex that may mediate these behaviors and show more activity. In addition to neurological data, anthropological and anatomical evidence corroborates a general purpose model of the human cortex. Ernst Mayr explained it this way: there's much to indicate that physically the human brain reached its present capacity nearly 100,000 years ago, at a time in which our ancestors were culturally still at a very primitive level. The brain of 100,000 years ago is the same brain that is now able to design computers. The highly special mental activities that we see in humans today seem not not to require an ad hoc selected brain structure. All the achievements of the human intellect were reached with brains not specifically selected for these tasks by Darwinian processes. You know, the pathway for genes to behavior is anything but straightforward. The rendering may be genetic and neurological explanations of behavior overly simplistic, rendering many genetic and neurological explanations of human behavior overly simplistic. Genes do not code directly for any particular trait, especially behavior. Genes code for proteins, which constitute the entire body structure, including the nervous system. One of the functions of the nervous system is behavior, the actions of muscles and glands in response to environmental stimulation. Sorry. Perhaps more than any other phenotypic type, behavior does not occur in a vacuum. The expression of behavior always depends on substantial environmental input. So, while the ultimate causes of an individual's behavior occur in the evolutionary history of the species, as coded in the genes, and that in that individual's past experiences, both processes produce the effects first on the structure of the brain. The former mostly during prenatal development, and the later mostly after birth. It's important to note that although evolutionary causation of structural or behavioral traits is coded in the gene, the causation is not in the genes. Likewise, although the causation of behavioral traits due to learning is coded somehow in the nervous system, the causation is not in the nervous system, as some authors strongly imply. Because of the complex interactions between learning and inheritance, their relative contributions to behavior cannot be teased apart, and certainly not by the heritability studies of the behavior geneticist. Such studies, flawed as they are methodologically, can at best only estimate the correlation between questionable phenotypical differences in a population, such as differences in IQ scores and genetic differences. What modern denial? Is there a modern denial of human nature? I don't think so. In fact, quite the opposite. Hardly a day goes by without hearing about research on the role of inheritance in depression, homosexuality, intelligence, language, promiscuity, dyslexia, anorexia, and so on. And evolutionary psychology is such a hot field that some individuals have simply become evolutionary psychologists by declaration without any special training in biology, evolutionary theory, genetics, or without conducting any scientific research in these areas. Moreover, many of the claims made by evolutionary psychologists are elaborate just so stories based on less than adequate scientific evidence or logic. Countless introductory psychology textbooks now include sections on evolutionary psychology not because a strong case for it has been made, but because it is currently in vogue to explain behavior due to genes selected during the Philistino era when we were hunters and gatherers. I would contend that, if anything, there's a modern denial of the role of learning in human behavior. There are several possible reasons, including poor public relations by learning theorists or simple ignorance by the media. In the public, and even psychologists are about the public and even psychologists about the voluminous research over the past century on the specific ways in which experiences change behavior. Perhaps most important, the experiences we refer to as learning are extremely complex with such speech and fluidity, and as such, and at such a constant rates that their observation is rendered difficult even under controlled laboratory conditions. Another possible factor in the denial of learning is that if we acknowledge that learning accounts for the most human behavior, you know, accounts for the most human behavior and differences in human behavior, then it becomes harder for us to shrink our responsibility in solving problems caused by human behavior. What is learning? Learning is typically defined in terms of specific changes in behavior due to certain kinds of experiences. Over the past century, scientists have discovered two overlapping kinds of experiences called classical and operant learning, which produce such behavioral changes. In classical learning, an otherwise neutral stimulus, such as the sight of a dog, can come to elicit a response such as fear, if the sight of the dog occurs reliably with a stimulus that already exhibits fear, such as being bitten by that dog. In operant learning, behaviors are either strengthened, reinforced, or weakened or punished by their consequences. For example, if a parent gives a child candy, reinforcing consequence every time the child screams, then the child will continue to scream more. Classical conditioning was first quantified was by the Russian philologist Ivan Pavlov. you know, and contrary to its popular reputation of dealing so only with slobbering dogs, it has now been shown to influence a range of phenomenon in humans, including anxiety and phobias, physical dependence produced by drugs, such as heroin and alcohol, taste aversions, psychosomatic disorders, and sexual arousal, and immunosuppression caused by treatments for cancer. Operant learning has been shown to account for a much wider range of behavior, including most of all actions involving skeletal muscle activity. Operant learning has been observed in species ranging from simple to complex and has been even been observed in individual nerve cells because of its ubiquity and relevance to behaviors related to language, intelligence, and consciousness. It's surprising that learning is rarely mentioned in but by psychological scholars. Learning as a parsimonious explanation of behavior. In many instances where evolutionary explanations are offered for human behavior, learning explanations are far more parsimonious, which means that they explain the same facts with fewer assumptions. Consider phobias. Sociobiologist O. Wilson claims that humans have a genetic aversion to snakes, as evidenced by his contentions that humans are much more likely to develop their fear and even full known phobias to snakes rather than to guns, knives, and automobiles. For Wilson, this aversion to snakes is due to the constant exposure through evolutionary time to the malign influence of snakes, with the repeated experience encoded by natural selections as a heredity aversion and fascination. First, then, we must realize that to account that not everyone who is bitten by a snake will learn to fear snakes, so we must have a science that can account for such individual differences. Nevertheless, if we assume that in general humans are more likely to develop their fears and phobias to snakes than to cars or knives, the question we must ask is what most parsimoniously explains it. The sociobiological explanation is appealing and makes evolutionary sense, but a number of learning explanations offer a simpler account, which conforms ultimately, by the way, as a note for myself, to uh, the simpler explanation is usually the correct one. I forget, I forget. Wait, somebody's razor that was like, I have to remember this. It's been a while. For example, it's well documented that the Pavlovian conditioning literature that the tendency to acquire specific conditioned reflexes, in this case is fears, is determined by the relative amount of experience one has with the stimulus that produced the reflexes. The more numerous experiences with an object that without adverse consequences, the longer it takes a fear to develop when there is a adverse consequence. For example, a typical person in our culture has countless experiences with cars and knives without any adverse consequences. If we are in an automobile accident or cut by a knife, it is only one unpleasant experiences in a sea of experiences with those objects that have not produced adverse consequences. So we are less likely to develop a fear. Learning theorists would say that the myriad of non adverse experiences with knives and cars has produced a latent inhibition with respect to developing conditioned emotional responses in response to them. That means that it would take a relatively many more unpleasant or painful experiences before fear of those objects would develop. Most of us, however, have very few, if any, direct experience with snakes. If one of those rare experiences produce an adverse outcome, i.e., the snake bites us, it may be more likely to condition the fear quickly because there is no built up reservoir of non adverse experiences to counter it. So the speed of learning may be due to those experiences rather than to a specific evolutionary predisposition. Fear of snakes can also be acquired by observing and modeling others' extreme reactions to them, either in real life or in movies, and relatedly by being told by someone's bad experiences with a snake. Interestingly, Pavlovian learning is implicated in these types of learning as well. Finally, as Stuart Viss of Connecticut College reminds us, because they are live animals, snakes are less predictable and controllable than objects such as cars or knives. Being physically close to a knife is not risky, whereas being physically close to a snake can be. Perhaps what we've inherited is a predisposition to learn fears quickly from such unpredictable and uncontrollable events, but we must learn the fear of snakes nonetheless. It is the case of phobias and learning's explanations are preferable to socio-biological explanations because they require fewer assumptions and because the principles for which they refer, latent inhibition and modeling, have been demonstrated in countless experiments. The explanation requires many assumptions about the history of hominins and their relationships to the snakes, to snakes, not not all of which, by the way, are dangerous. The denial of learning in human behavior. To find evidence of a modern denial of human learning, one need look no further than the field of psychology. Most introductory psychology textbooks devote an entire chapter to the principles of classical and operant and social learning. Learning is said to account for much of the human behavior, but then, oddly, those principles are rarely, if ever, even mentioned in the succeeding chapters that deal with learned behaviors involved in remembering, perceiving, thinking, or emotional responses. Learning is even given a short shrift when dealing with such obvious examples as social and maladaptive behaviors, despite the fact that it has been demonstrated to be a critical determinant of these behaviors. For example, nowadays it's customary to explain problem behaviors such as anxiety, depression, ADHD, and learning disabilities as having a strong inherited component. Learning, however, provides a much simpler and more easily testable explanation, but the learning account gets little press. Moreover, the effective therapies for treating these behavioral problems have not come from evolutionary psychology, but from learning theory. Because of the almost infinite because of the almost infinite flexibility of the human cortex, learning determines most everything we do. Among behaviors we learn talking, reading, writing, and doing math, thinking logically, interacting socially, playing sports, and musical instruments. Even behaviors that on the surface seem to represent closed programs, such as standing, walking, reaching, grasping, perceptual abilities that may have a significant learned component. Many theorists who deny the importance of learning in human behavior often pay lip service to this, but for them it's never more important. It's never more than some unspecified passive process, a mere annoyance along the road to understanding that what they perceive to be the essence of human behavior, genes. The not denial of learning language. One often learning is flatly denied for behaviors that clearly have a strong learning component. In his book, The Language Instinct, for example, Pinker writes in his usual self assured manner: first, let us do away with the folklore that parents teach their children language. Wow. Pinker compares language to sitting, standing, walking, which, according to him, parents don't teach and which children do anyways. Pinker also denies the role of of imitation in language learning when he writes the very concept of imitation is to suspect to begin with. If children are such natural, general imitators, why don't they imitate their parents' habit of sitting quietly in airplanes? And that normal children do not learn language by imitating their parents. That is such a stretch, man. That question is just such a. How do you go and jump from if children are such, general and imitators that how do you jump from this basically? They basically say if children don't sit quietly as their parents do, then imitation is bullshit, and I think that's a stretch. I really do. Because children imitate most of the time. The fact that they don't some of the time hardly discredits this. Like that's such a just insane way of going about it. And by the way, I'm adding my own notes. I'm not reading this all to you. You're getting me who often reads things into YouTube and then comments on them. Statements such as these, revealing no appreciation for the subtle power of learning and a lack of knowledge of the sizable body in which the experimental research on it. When linguists and psychologists repeat the tired rhetoric that parents don't teach their children language, what they really mean is that parents don't intentionally teach their children how to talk, as if anyone ever suggested this. This does not mean, however, that children don't learn language from parents, just as learning theorists in the 1960s reanalyzed the tapes of the so-called non-directive therapy sessions by the humanist psychotherapist Carl Rogers and discovered that he was actually reinforcing his clients' positive self-statements, forcing Rogers to change the name of his approach to client-centered. Psychologist Ernest Morick exhaustively reanalyzed psychologist Roger Brown's data on early language interactions between mothers and children, and in so doing, identified detailed instances of mothers prompting and reinforcing vocal imitations and shaping the suggestive approximations among behavioral processes. Such processes are subtle and difficult to identify if one's view of reinforcement is a naive, simplistic one in which only praise for speaking appropriately counts. The principle of reinforcement derives from the more general law of effect, which states that behavior is determined by its consequences. Specific reinforcement is any consequence that is produced by a behavior that causes that behavior to occur again or to be strengthened under certain circumstances. Thus, reinforcement is defined by how functions in a manner analogous to natural selection. Reinforcement operates from behavioral variation. The reinforcement of babbling. A good example of the subtle role reinforcement in language acquisition is babbling. Babbling infants begin around 4 to 6 months of age when the larynx descends into the throat. Instead of being able to breathe and drink simultaneously as babies can do before that time, they can now make all of the phonetic sounds found in the human language. The question is how the amorphous sea of phonemes is transformed into the intelligible sounds of a parent's language, usually by the second year of life. Someone naive about learning theory might answer by saying that parents reinforce the sounds they like and ignore the sounds they don't like. Why most parents do respond more excitedly when their infants make sounds, especially recognizable ones. This probability only contributes to the the continued strength of the infant's efforts, not to the shaping of specific, oh god, phone means or the god, god, these words are not familiar. You know, one only an understanding of reinforcement would lead to the claim that it plays no role in the acquisition and maintenance of infant or even adult speech. Although parents do not intentionally reinforce verbal behavior in their children, the form of reinforcement that is responsible for shaping infant baffling into recognizable, god damn it, foams of their native language is a more subtle form called automatic reinforcement. Here's how it works. Beginning before birth, infants hear countless hours of human chatter. When they begin to babble, some of the sounds they make, i.e., those of their native language, sound good and familiar in the sense that they match the sounds the infants has heard since before birth. The rest of the sounds they hear themselves utter are not familiar. Hearing themselves match familiarity sounds reinforces those sounds automatically, and no other person reinforces them. And so infants keep making them. And this is the main reason that deaf infants stop babbling. Automatic reinforcement, automatic reinforcement also explains why the cadence and inflection of infant babbling sounds as if the infant is actually talking, something that drives parents crazy, trying to understand what their babbling infants are saying. And of course, they're not actually saying anything. In this case, not only are the individual phonemes, like this is a hard word. I'm like, is this about phenomenon? Like, god damn it! Like, see, part of the problem with this is that I'm not. Although I am interested in linguistics, like I might know like various things, like what a misnomer is, which is just a word that doesn't accurately describe what it was referring to, basically. But phonemes, like what the fuck? Sorry. Like is this the singular of phenomenon? The same phenomenon occurs when we take on the colloquial expression or accents of roommates, or but that would be the singular of friends whom we like or admire, or when we find ourselves using trendy words and expressions. Other people don't intentionally reinforce us for talking like them, except in the usual way of by listening and responding. Hearing ourselves sound like our friends or using trendy words automatically reinforces the use of these expressions in the sense that we continue to use them. The process occurs without awareness, but it occurs nonetheless. In addition to this interpretation being parsimonious, it has experimental support, which, by the way, I mean, if you want to pursue this paper, it like it's out there, and you can look this up, and you can find all the footnotes. Learning real words. Detractors may claim that babbling is not real language, so we must provide evidence, provide other examples of how language is learned. Once the phonemic sounds and sound combination of a child's native language have been shaped by automatic reinforcements, parents are ready to hear real words. So when they hear mama or dada, they respond excitedly, often repeating the words. Both reactions functioning as reinforcement, and continue to do so as new words emerge. And yes, they also use the imitation to teach new words such as say spoon, can you say spoon? And then responding with right, spoon. When children use words to request things, i.e., food, comfort, relief from pain, parents provide those things. Parents' responses are not necessary to children to learn how to say words. They learn through imitation. And by the way, I mean, this is like my family has frequent pain, by the way, and they mentioned this. Um, Mom can't take Advil anymore, ibuprofen, but whenever I have a headache, I definitely reach for it because that's learned behavior. And one more aspect of it. We don't go out and buy Advil. We go out and buy ibuprofen, the generic, which is also something that is learned behavior. Their generics are often the same drug with the same active. You know, and they're often cheaper, so you prefer generic when possible. In fact, they almost invariably are cheaper. Like, you will never find a case in which they're more expensive. At worst, they would match the price. But that's exception. That's going to be exceptionally rare with a generic. I've always been amazed that Chomsky and Pinker don't seem to understand more than any other behavior. Verbal behavior is social behavior, and in the absence of an environment where words and sentences do something for the speaker, they won't occur. Following from Darwin, we must look for the function of behavior. Hmm. I don't know. I mean, sometimes I find myself accidentally, unintentionally, like thinking out loud, but I'm not necessarily looking for a response from other people. My thought process has just crossed that, over into thinking out loud, which, by the way, I'm doing right now. I'm just doing it into a camera, knowing that somebody will watch this. You know, Darwin, we must look for the function of behavior. For example, an infant raised all alone on a desert island with a tape player constantly playing human speech may eventually learn to say the same words, but the words will never be used in a functional way because they won't do anything for the child. These words won't get the infant anything in the absence of other people, listeners, who won't know how to respond to the infant's request. The infant will be little more than a parrot. This explains a popular example that Chomsky linguists use to counter the suggestion that language is learned and to suggest that language is learned to suggest that language is learned and to suppose the suggestion of language acquisition device, namely that children of immigrants who spend their time in the streets playing with other children learn the language of their adopted country faster than parents who take classes. As anyone who ever took a foreign language class in school knows, learning a language in a classroom doesn't teach many conversational skills, whereas being immersed in a language environment will teach you conversational skills because the words you learn actually produce immediate and naturally reinforcing effects. Countless experiments have shown that various aspects of language, including grammar, can be acquired through operant and social learning. However, a longitudinal study by Betty Hart and Todd Risley demonstrates convincingly that proponents' language and interaction styles determine their children's language and interaction styles. You know, um, oh God, that parents' language and interaction styles determine their children's language and interaction styles. That's uh, the study and the dozens of showing the operant learning of language should be put to rest once and for all the critics' claims that children don't learn language from their parents. In Hart and Risley's study, language interactions between 42 American children from birth to 2.5 years of age and their families were observed in the home for 1 hour a month. Not only was the children's amount of talking shown to be directly related to the parents' amount of talking, but 86 to 90% of the actual words in the child's vocabulary were also the parents' vocabulary. There were strong correlations between what the parents were actually did during their actions and what with their language learning children and the children's language development. For example, the child's rate of vocabulary growth was a direct function of how many different nouns and modifiers they heard and how much the parents reinforced the children's utterances with approval or by repeating what the children said. These relationships hold up at age 3, as they did with the children's performances on standardized achievement and in intelligence tests, i.e., IQ scores, when they were 9 years old. In addition, the data also revealed slower vocabulary rates when parents were, in initiated verbal interactions, reinforcing the child for initiating or issued imperatives, questions of or choices, or outright prohibitions, punishments for speaking. The data from the Heart Wisely study are real data from parents teaching their children a real language, and not the idealized sentences or rationalized musings of Chomsky linguists. And they offer a compelling picture of the enormous impact of learning has on language acquisition. Finally, Pinker's claim that children do not learn by imitating but is simply wrong. As Claire Paulson and her colleagues, among numerous others, have shown, true children do not imitate everything their parents say or do, but when initiating produces reinforcing consequences, parent children imitate and so do adults. Anyone who has been around a young child knows that they imitate much of what they hear and see, and children and adults use imitations and modeling as the main way to learn words and simple sentences in the first place. Conclusion. We must not overlook the importance of evolution and inheritance, especially when explaining the distinguishing differences between humans and other animals. At the same time, we must not deny the importance of human learning. If we overlook learning as the primary determinant of human behavior in our search for elusive genes and the vague mental construct, we will be at a big disadvantage in solving serious problems. Knowledge of learning principles and developing programs of behavior therapy and applied behavior analysis has already greatly improved the lives of children with autism, with other mental disabilities and children behavioral problems, as well as otherwise normal children and adults in a variety of settings, from the home to the school to the workplace. In his keynote address to the 1998, the 89th Annual Convention of the American Psychological Association in 1990, a week before his death, the famous American psychologist B.F. Skinner noted, after almost a century and a half, evolution is still not widely understood. It is vigorously opposed by defenders of a creator. The role of variation and selection learning in the behavior of individuals suffers from the same opposition. One can only hope that with time and better scientific training of psychologists, learning will universally be recognized as the most important element of human behavior. You know, now that is very interesting. The the study that was referenced in citation 19 is Tempe EGK-A Poldrak SL Murray. So this was natural defects in children with dyslexia ameliorated by behavioral remediations. Evidence showed up on the fMRIs of the role that human behavior had in reshaping their brains, which is a study that you might want to read. If you are interested in what I've been talking about today, to pursue on your own independently. But these are all good references, that are in here in Skept. And this was printed a long while back in, a magazine that I've come to like and admire. Should probably subscribe myself, but this is Skeptic Magazine. You know, I've long said that I cannot suppress my own skeptical nature, and here, it's been a long time coming. I haven't said anything. I've been content to hang back and stay quiet, but I'm a social person and a being, and the you should know that this is of interest to me, and I really I found myself thinking that Steven Pinker kind of strawman fallacy behaviorism. He didn't. I mean, as somebody that's become interested in what B.F. Skinner, had to say and everything in his book and is reading it, I would just say that my own view of this matter is that the blank slate as a book just kind of misunderstood the point. It missed it. We talk about strawman fallacies when somebody distorts an argument being made by somebody and then argues against them as if, they actually debunked their point, but they were actually arguing against the straw man that they invented, which was not the position of the person, that they were actually arguing against. We talk about this a lot. I've educated the public in this on purpose and what the straw man fallacy ultimately is, but I will say that I feel that Steven Pinker straw man did. I feel that, as somebody that's become interested in this, I will firmly assert, for the matter, that I have no denial whatsoever of the fact that genetics plays a role, you know, in humans. Like, of course, genetics has a role. The question for me is, just how extensive that role happens to be. Like, and to be honest with you, oh yes, now it finally hits me. One of the things about learning is that it can, and what the author was talking about with, the simplicity of explaining it by learning and it being parsimonious. Occam's razor, you know, Occam's razor is, it comes up in scientific discussions a lot, you know, you know like when and also tech talks and discussions that take place and by the way my bot is working. Ugh. Oh shit. So let's go to something more reliable than the AI. What is Occam's razor in simple terms? So what is our example? What is our no? This is generative AI again. God damn it! I don't want that. I want something that people trust. The origin and the popular use of Occam's razor. Although scientists have been familiar with the principle of Occam's razor for centuries, it became more widely known to the general public after the movie Contact came out in 1997. The movie, based on a novel written by Carl Sagan, starring Jodie Foster as a SETI scientist, Dr. Ellie involves the first confirmed communication received on Earth by extraterrestrial intelligence, then that's what happens. The communication is eventually discovered to be a diagram built a transporter by which Ellie uses to travel through a series of wormholes to visit the one of the aliens who made the transport possible, and the first step towards interstellar space travel. When Ellie returns, she estimates that she was gone for about 18 hours, only to find that in Earth time it had appeared that she never left. Her story is doubted when it's revealed that her recording device recorded nothing but static. When Ellie tries to persuade the others that she actually did travel through time, she is reminded of the principle of Occam's razor. The easiest explanation tends to be the right ones, meaning that she probably never left. You know, and not only until the end of the movie it is revealed that she recorded approximately 18 hours of static time. The principle of Occam's razor is generally attributed to William of Occam, spelled Occam, an English theologian, logician, and Franciscan friar. In William of Occam's terms, he wrote in Latin, "Nequam ponda est pluralitas sine necessitate," or plurality must never be posited without necessity. The basic principle, however, was enunciated as far back as Aristotle. The more limited, if adequate, is always preferable. And Ptolemy, we consider it a good principle to explain the phenomenon by the simplest hypothesis possible. It has been related in the works of Isaac Newton. We are to admit no more causes of natural things than such that are both true and sufficient to explain their appearances. Although the true origin of Occam's razor is debatable, William of Occam historically gets the credit in large parts to the writings of the 1852 of William Hamilton, 5th Baronet, a Scottish metaphysics philosopher who first coined the term Occam's razor. Occam's razor is used as a heuristic or rule of thumb to guide scientists in developing theoretical models. The term razor refers to the shaving away of unnecessary assumptions when distinguishing between two theories. Although many other scientists uses Occam's razor is used in biology to determine evolutionary chains and in medicine for use in diagnosis. While Occam's razor isn't a useful tool, it has been known to obstruct scientific progress at times. It was used to accept simplistic and initially incorrect explanations for meteorites, ball lightning, continental drift, atomic theory, and DNA as the carrier of genetic information, or ice, or once more research was done and more evidence brought to light, however, new theories emerged based on new information. Occam's razor doesn't necessarily go with the simplest theory, whether it's right or wrong. It's not an example of simplicity for simplicity's sakes. It merely tries to cut through the clutter to find the best theory based on the best scientific principles or knowledge at the time. It was doubtful that when positing this principle, William of Ockham knew he would be spawning a popular tagline. Besides the movie Contact, the principle has been mentioned in television shows, The X Files, Fringe, House, in an episode called Occam's Razor, and Castle as a means of finding the most logical solution to an illogical problem. Occam's razor has become part of the popular media. It is used as a scientific means of thwarting more fanciful, or dubious explanations for strange phenomena that the heroes of such shows encounters, but for which there is no easy explanation. So, basically, you know, the, in the simplest terms, to understand what this means is the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. All right. Well, thank you for your 50 minutes of time if you stuck with me to the end, which I doubt, but thank you if you did.